Hey guys, this is Pamela J. Hobart here, Philosophical Life Coaching. I have decided to make more videos, so I'll be making one with each post, and today's post is on internal family systems basics. You've probably heard about IFS. It's kind of like having a moment. So I signed up for a course about IFS for coaches, and that course just wrapped up. So here's my opportunity to kind of convey some of these basics to you and also solidify them for myself. So the core idea of IFS is that the human agent is multiple, not unified. This is what you've heard about the parts, right? Like you are not just one thing. You sort of have many constitutive elements. We can call them parts. Lots of people speak this way just intuitively. It's kind of springs from colloquial language and ordinary thought. So when you have times where you're kind of ambivalent about something, or you have inner conflict, you have indecision, or you get stuck, that's not actually that mysterious if you're made of parts. The parts sort of explain on some level why these things happen often and are not exceptions, but more like the rule. Since the parts are in there and you've got to live with them, they're never really like going away, you're never going to unify. That means the task of personal development, sort of inner work, is different than it is on the singular model of the human person. The task is more like getting the inner family to sort of work harmoniously than to like whittle some off or get them all to march in step or anything like that. There are a few different kinds of parts. So managers are like parts of you that are very proactive and goal oriented. They try to like move you towards what their goals are, which may or may not match sort of what you take your goals to be or what you wish your goals are. Firefighters are reactive. They defend you from harm. They sort of like spring into action when there's a threat. Exiles are kind of like extreme parts that you may have picked up from like trouble in the past. They're sort of like, your hurt inner children, and they are the ones that tend to throw your inner system out of balance the most. They're the ones that you're probably the most tempted to repress or ignore. And so a lot of the inner work tends to center around what your exiles, what they turn out to be, where they came from. So you aren't just your parts, though. You're yourself. And kind of, if you're not any one of the parts or sort of just the sum of them, if you're greater than the sum of the parts, then what is that? That's the self. This is where things get a little bit woo sounding. It's kind of like, well, what is it? But if you just think about it, self is kind of more like an orientation with these characteristics. I think, again, it's something that is sort of shows up in colloquial language and everyday thought. It's not super woo. So you're living and thinking and deciding from self when you feel curious, calm, confident, compassionate towards others, when you have a sense of clarity, when you feel creative, courageous, and connected to other people. So this is sort of like what people are describing when they talk about an abundance mindset. Another way of thinking about that, I know, garbage term, but another way of thinking about the abundance mindset is that it's sort of like anchored in self. You are not like this tiny scared thing. You're not collapsing into like your exile part. You're the big thing. You're the thing that has a lot of vital energy, that sort of is competent and feels like it wants to go do these tasks of living and keep growing and be engaged with other people. When you don't feel these ways, that's like a sign that you're showing up as, like blending into one of the parts that has sort of its own agenda rather than living from self. Since this is a little slippery, I have spoken about it in a few different ways with people, and I made little images to go with this. So one way you might think of self is sort of above the fray of all the parts. This is like yourself is sort of like the guiding star of the inner system. The parts participate in it, but they're not like on the same level. The self is kind of like higher in the sense of being like pure or better. But the opposite also seems true. Like yourself, you might also think of as it being like well rooted and kind of foundational. So in that case, the parts are kind of growing up and out, and they're crooked because you've seen some shit, but like they grow up out of the self, but the self is like always in there. And another imagery that might work for self is sort of when you feel centered, right? Like physically in the center of your body, or like metaphorically centered. Sometimes we think of like a heart center. Heart's sort of in the center, and the parts are like various distances from it. They might be like kind of in flux away from it, but the self is in there. I realize this is like a little woo, but again, I think it's not highly technical. This is not like contrived. These concepts really do show up in useful, ordinary thought about the self. So parts work. Well, if you have a self and you have these parts and you also have like various problems and challenges, then, you fix them by doing the parts work. If you're not going to lop the parts off, like sort of eject them or repress them, if you can't force them to do what you'd like them to do, then the other alternatives are sort of come from, like what any leader would do when they're faced with a group of disparate people that they can't eject. They have to try to get them to cooperate. So you might listen to the people who you're trying to lead, get to know them a little bit, stop making assumptions about them that may not be true. You will try to make like credible assurances to your follower parts that you will help them get their needs met. And so parts work is like, it's this ongoing process. If you have a part of you that really needs something, it's not going to be enough typically to just say like, no, you don't need that, or I already gave it to you. Like those moves don't work when you're trying to lead someone. Instead, you have to say like, I actually care about you. Look at these times that I've helped. Like I'm meeting you halfway. I'm not going to take orders from the part, but we can still have like a working relationship that makes the family system get along. So if this starts to feel too woo for you, I mean, the parts are, it's like a manner of speaking. It's not as if like your brain is cut up into regions and like that's the exile and that's the manager. It might be more like mental modules is one way that like philosophers of mind have spoken about sort of like patterns that a human has, or like habits of thought, habits of emotion that can conflict. So you don't really actually have to think that like, there's a family in your head. And even as I was going through this course, the instructors are like these therapist guys, and I don't, that vibe is not for me. The people who show up in my practice and who read this are a little, more cognitive and kind of thinkier than the feelers. But it's important that we give this approach its due. Like sometimes we do as clear of thinking as we can around these parts, patterns, modules, and there's still something left. We make the best arguments, but it doesn't resolve. So at that point, we have to kind of move to emotional tools. So the example I've got here in the blog post is you might have a part that is essentially protecting you from perpetual work. So often clients show up to coaching and they procrastinate. They procrastinate in the morning, right? And once they get working, they can kind of keep going, but they have trouble getting started. And so, we sort of try ordinary stuff like, oh, could you do Pomodoro, or like eat the frog, or do the opposite, warm up into your work? Maybe nothing's doing it. And so what may end up being the case sometimes is that there is like a part of that client that is afraid that the work will never end, right? And it's very easy to feel this way when you have a to-do list that's 8 miles long and you have a boss that gives you more than you can do, and you also heap tasks on yourself for your free time. Right? Like it's easy to get the feeling at a like subconscious level that the work is never going to end. So this part's trying to protect you from perma work, and they're trying to do that by cutting time off the front. Right? Like if it can't get you to like stop working, it's going to delay the start. As if maybe it's kind of, got limited control, but it's going to take what it can get. So if you have a part like that, you have to find ways to build trust in yourself via this part, which is like, look, we're going to get started now, but also we're stopping. We're stopping at 3 p.m., we're stopping at 4 p.m., we're stopping at noon and taking 2 hours off. And the more times you start and stop, you build credibility with yourself. You build credibility with the part that's protecting you from perma work. And then these things, you may still have some level of ambivalence about starting work, but it won't become totally prohibitive. I do have some questions and reservations about IFS. I don't really understand if they mean this totally metaphorically, but I mean, it's not like mental ontology is an uncontroversial thing. So whatever it is, it is. I don't want to do parts work explicitly in my coaching. I don't want you to sit there and draw them. Is your part chartreuse or magenta? That's not my style, but I think that probably a little more than I've been doing naturally is fine. And the court's validated that. Some of these IFS people do it very explicitly, and others it's kind of more integrated into another toolkit. I was skeptical about the claim that the self is kind of necessarily there in everyone, perfect and undamaged and uncorrupted. There's just no evidence for that. Some people are in such a bad place that they have difficulty ever tapping into self. I would tend to see that as regrowing self, or maybe developing it for the first time when that process, a developmental process that had been arrested for that person, rather than it was always in there and you uncovered it. But probably some people find that motivational, would be my guess. Some people probably find that motivational to think that it's already there, and that they're not starting from nowhere. So fine. And also, I mean, some families, with the hands that they're dealt, certain members with different personalities and certain baggage, some families, success for them at getting along looks different than families that sort of got dealt a better hand. You don't know what success is at something other than the context. For some people's inner families, making the system play nicely together might not look that impressive, but for that person, that level of inner conflict is actually low, to them. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that oh, poof, you can just do parts work and it's suddenly going to be real happy in there or whatever. Cool. This is September 2021. In case you're watching this later, I'm doing some free parts practice sessions. It's just 30 minutes, no charge. We will talk about your parts. I want to get a little more comfortable trying this stuff. I don't usually do free sessions, so it might be a fun chance to meet and mess around. If you're watching this after I've closed those, I also offer a specially priced intro session. It's not a sales call. We'll talk about your stuff. You can find it on my site, PamelaJHobart.com. And thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.